Nevada Territory, 1868, 3 years after the end of the Civil War. The auctioneer's hammer struck with a crack that seemed to split the dusty air of Copper Creek. Virginia Caldwell flinched at the sound, though she had been expecting it. The rough hemp rope binding her wrists chafed against her skin as she stood on the wooden platform, blinking against the harsh afternoon sun. "Next for auction," announced the portly auctioneer, his voice carrying a note of discomfort. "Miss Virginia Caldwell, age 25, from Philadelphia, being sold to cover her late father's debts of 300." A murmur rippled through the crowd gathered in the town square. Women clutched the arms of their husbands or shepherded their children away from the spectacle. Men assessed her with calculating eyes, some curious, others predatory. Virginia Ginny, to those who had once known her, stood with her spine straight and chin lifted, the way her father had taught her. Colonel William Caldwell's voice echoed in her memory. "A Caldwell never shows weakness, especially when surrounded by enemies." "She can read and write," continued the auctioneer, consulting a wrinkled paper. "Educated as a music teacher, specializes in piano." A burly miner with a sun-weathered face spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "What good's piano playing out here? Can she cook, clean, work a garden?" Laughter erupted from the crowd, harsh and mocking. Once the respected daughter of a Union Army colonel, now being appraised like livestock. Her father's gambling debts and subsequent accusations of treason had stripped away everything, their Philadelphia home, her position as a music teacher, her future prospects, and finally her dignity. Something broke inside Ginny, then a dam of restraint crumbling under months of suffering. "Laugh if you must," she called out, her voice clear and strong despite her parched throat. "But I am not merchandise. I am a person, just as all of you are." The crowd fell silent, startled by her outburst. Even the auctioneer blinked in surprise, his hammer momentarily forgotten in his hand. At the back of the gathering, partially hidden in the shadow of the general store's awning, a tall figure shifted his weight, wincing slightly as he placed pressure on his left leg. Nathaniel Nate Harrison observed the woman on the platform with an intensity that might have unnerved her had she noticed. The scar that ran from his left temple down to his jaw pulled tight as he frowned. At 38, the former Union Army major still carried himself with military bearing, despite the limp that served as a constant reminder of Antietam. His weathered face and prematurely graying hair at the temples told the story of a man who had seen too much suffering. As Ginny stood defiant on the auction block, something flickered in Nate's memory. A melody sweet and sorrowful played on a piano at a fundraising concert for wounded soldiers. The graceful hands of a young woman in blue, her face partially obscured in his recollection, but her music unforgettable. Could this be the same woman? Before Nate could pursue the thought further, another voice cut through the silence. "I'll give $50 for her." The crowd parted to reveal Judd Blackwell, owner of the Silver Crown Saloon and the most profitable silver mine in the territory. His immaculate suit and polished boots stood in stark contrast to the dusty attire of those around him. A cruel smile played at the corners of his mouth as he twirled the end of his waxed mustache. $50, the auctioneer repeated, visibly relieved that the bidding had begun. "Do I hear 60? Oh." Nate's jaw tightened. He knew Blackwell's reputation all too well. The missing girls, the bruised faces of the women who worked in his establishment, the suspicious deaths that never seemed to result in charges. 60, Nate called out, stepping forward into the sunlight. Heads turned surprised to hear the voice of the reclusive rancher who rarely ventured into town except for supplies. Blackwell's eyes narrowed when he spotted Nate. "Well, well, Major Harrison graces us with his presence." He emphasized the military rank with a sneer. 75. 100, Nate countered without hesitation. The crowd's murmurs grew louder. $100 was a significant sum in Copper Creek, enough to buy a decent horse or supplies for several months. Blackwell's smile never faltered, but something dangerous flashed in his eyes. 150. 200, Nate replied, his voice steady. My, Blackwell drawled, turning to address the crowd. "The good major seems mighty eager. Perhaps he knows something about Miss Caldwell that we don't." He faced Ginny directly, his smile sharpening. "Or maybe he doesn't know about her terrible secret." Ginny paled, her moment of defiance crumbling as Blackwell's words struck their target. From the steps of the nearby hotel, 70-year-old Margaret Winters watched the proceedings with concerned eyes. The widow's lined face betrayed nothing, but her gnarled hands gripped her shawl tightly. She had operated the Copper Creek Hotel for nearly 2 decades and had seen her fair share of auctions, but this one felt different, more personal, more dangerous. 250, Nate said, refusing to take Blackwell's bait. 300, Blackwell countered immediately. The full amount of the debt. His smile widened as he delivered what he clearly believed was a winning blow. Nate hesitated only a moment before meeting Blackwell's gaze directly. 350. A collective gasp rose from the onlookers. Such an amount was unheard of, especially for someone whose worth in the territory was questionable at best. Blackwell's facade cracked slightly, the confident smile faltering. He hadn't expected to be outbid, certainly not by the reclusive Harrison. After a moment of tense silence, he gave a curt nod. "She's all yours, Major." His voice dropped to a menacing undertone. "For now." With that, Blackwell turned and stalked away, his expensive boots kicking up dust that settled on the crowd like a warning. The auctioneer brought down his hammer with finality. "Sold to Mr. Harrison for $350. Ginny stood frozen, uncertain if her situation had improved or worsened. She had heard of Nathaniel Harrison, the solitary rancher who lived miles outside town. The widower who rarely spoke, the former Union officer with a reputation for fairness, but also for unpredictable moods. Was he her salvation or merely a different kind of prison? Nate approached the platform, money pouch in hand. He paid the auctioneer without comment, then turned to Ginny. "Miss Caldwell," he said quietly, offering his hand to help her down from the platform. "My wagon's over there." His touch was brief but steady as she descended the steps on trembling legs. The rough rope fell away from her wrist, leaving angry red marks that she rubbed absently. As Nate led her toward a weathered wagon hitched to two sturdy horses, Margaret Winters intercepted them, her lined face set with determination. "Mr. Harrison," she greeted him with a nod. "You'll be needing some supplies for the young lady, I expect." Nate hesitated, clearly unused to considering such matters. Margaret continued without waiting for his response. "I've put together some necessities." She gestured to a brown paper parcel on the hotel steps. "Nothing fancy, mind you, but enough to get her settled." "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Winters," Nate replied, the formality in his tone suggesting their acquaintance was cordial but distant. "Not kindness, Mr. Harrison. Decency." Margaret turned her attention to Ginny, assessing her with keen eyes. "You hold your head up, child. This town's quick to judge and slow to forgive, but not everyone here is without compassion." With that cryptic statement, she bustled back toward the hotel, leaving Ginny to wonder at the unexpected alliance. Nate retrieved the package and placed it in the wagon before offering Ginny a hand up to the bench seat. Once settled beside her, he took the reins and clicked his tongue, urging the horses forward. They left Copper Creek in silence, the town growing smaller behind them as they headed north along a winding dirt road. The vastness of the Nevada landscape spread out around them, rolling hills covered with sagebrush. Distant mountains purple against the horizon, a sky so wide and blue it seemed impossible. Only when the town was no longer visible did Ginny find her voice. "Why did you do that, Mr. Harrison?" she asked, staring straight ahead. "Why pay so much money for someone you don't even know?" Nate kept his eyes on the trail. "You needed help. There are many people who need help in this world, Mr. Harrison. You can't possibly save them all." A muscle in his jaw twitched. "No, I can't." After a moment, he added, "But sometimes a person gets a chance to do one right thing. I took mine." His cryptic answer raised more questions than it answered, but something in his tone warned against pressing further. Instead, Ginny watched the landscape, trying to imagine what life would be like on a remote ranch with this taciturn stranger. The silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the creak of wagon wheels and the steady rhythm of hooves against dirt. After what seemed like hours but was likely only 40 minutes, Nate guided the horses off the main trail onto a narrower path that wound through a stand of pine trees. "Lone Pine is just beyond that ridge," he said, nodding toward a gentle slope ahead. "My ranch." As they crested the hill, Ginny caught her breath. Below them lay a small valley, verdant and peaceful, cradled between protective ridges. A creek meandered through its center, its waters catching the late afternoon sunlight like scattered diamonds. Near its bank stood a two-story log house, solid and well-maintained, with a large barn and several outbuildings nearby. Horses grazed in a fenced pasture, and a small herd of cattle could be seen in the distance. It wasn't grand by Eastern standards, but in the harsh landscape of the Nevada Territory, It was an oasis, a place where life had not just survived, but flourished. "It's beautiful," Ginny said softly, meaning it. Nate's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "It was my wife's choice. Clara had an eye for beauty." The past tense didn't escape Ginny's notice, but she held her questions as they descended into the valley. The horses seemed to quicken their haste, sensing home and rest after the journey. As they approached the house, Nate pulled the wagon to a stop and set the brake. Before helping Ginny down, he turned to face her directly. "Miss Caldwell, before we go inside, I want to be clear about something." His voice was steady, his gaze direct. "You are not property here. I paid your debt because it seemed like the right thing to do, but that doesn't make you beholden to me." Ginny stared at him, trying to understand what he was saying. "You'll work for fair wages," he continued. "Cooking, cleaning, whatever needs doing around the house. In return, you'll have room and board and a small salary. When you've saved enough, or if you decide this isn't where you want to be, you're free to leave, no questions asked." Relief washed over Ginny, followed quickly by suspicion. In her experience, men rarely offered something for nothing, and her recent months had taught her painful lessons about trust. "And what else will be expected of me, Mr. Harrison?" she asked bluntly. Nate's expression hardened, a flash of anger in his eyes, quickly replaced by what might have been understanding. "Nothing of that nature, Miss Caldwell. You have my word as an officer and a gentleman. Your door has a lock, and only you will have the key." Shame colored Ginny's cheeks. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to imply—" "Yes, you did," he interrupted, "and given your circumstances, I can't fault you for it. But let me be clear, in this house you are safe, from me and from anyone else who might come calling." The conviction in his voice and the steadiness of his gaze convinced Ginny more than his words. She nodded, accepting his terms and his promise. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison." "Nate," he corrected her. "If we're going to be living under the same roof, Mr. Harrison will get tiresome quickly." "Then you must call me Ginny," she replied, the first genuine smile in months tugging at her lips. Nate helped her down from the wagon, his strong hands gentle but impersonal. As they entered the house, Ginny was struck by the unexpected warmth of the interior. The main room was spacious but sparsely furnished. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, currently cold in the summer heat. A wooden table with 4 chairs occupied the center of the room, while a worn sofa and 2 armchairs formed a small sitting area. Bookshelves lined another wall, filled with volumes that surprised Ginny with their variety history, poetry novels, and practical guides to ranching and animal husbandry. But what drew her attention immediately was the piano. It stood in the corner near a window, its dark wood gleaming in the late afternoon light that streamed through clean glass panes. It wasn't a grand instrument like those in Philadelphia's concert halls, but a smaller upright model, well used but clearly cared for. "You have a piano," Ginny whispered, moving toward it as if drawn by an invisible force. "It was Clara's," Nate said, setting down Margaret's package on the table. "She played every evening after supper. Said it reminded her of civilization." Ginny's fingers hovered over the keys without touching them, respecting the invisible boundary of ownership. "May I, Nate hesitated, then nodded once. "It should be played. Sitting silent doesn't honor her memory." Ginny sat carefully on the bench, adjusted her posture from muscle memory, and placed her hands on the keys. The first chord was slightly out of tune but resonant, filling the room with sound that seemed to chase away the shadows. She began a simple nocturne, one she had played countless times during her teaching days. Nate stood motionless, watching her with an unreadable expression. As the final notes faded, he cleared his throat. "It needs tuning," he said gruffly. "I can do that," Ginny offered. "I learned how in Philadelphia." He nodded, then gestured toward a staircase. "Your room is upstairs, first door on the right. Mine's at the end of the hall. The door between is—" He trailed off, a flicker of pain crossing his features before he controlled it. "Get settled in. Supper's at 6. With that, he turned and walked out the front door, presumably to tend to the horses and wagon. Ginny gathered Margaret's package and climbed the stairs, feeling the weight of unsaid things pressing down on her shoulders. At the top of the staircase, a narrow hallway led to 3 doors. The first on the right, as Nate had indicated, was unlocked. The bedroom was simple but comfortable. A single bed with a patchwork quilt, a small dresser with a mirror above it, a washstand with basin and pitcher, and a wardrobe. The window looked out over the creek and the mountains beyond. Fresh air and golden light filled the space, making it feel welcoming despite its plainness. Ginny unwrapped Margaret's package to find several practical items, two plain work dresses, undergarments, a nightgown, soap, hairbrush, and other necessities. A note tucked inside read simply, "Every woman deserves dignity. M.W." Tears sprang to Ginny's eyes at the unexpected kindness. She hadn't cried during the auction, nor during the humiliating journey from Philadelphia to Nevada. But this small act of compassion threatened to unravel her carefully maintained composure. After washing her face and changing into one of the clean dresses, Ginny ventured back into the hallway. Curiosity drew her toward the middle door, the one Nate had started to mention before stopping himself. It was closed but not locked. Common sense told her to respect his privacy, but something deeper urged her to understand the man who had purchased her freedom at such cost. Her hand hesitated on the doorknob before turning it slowly. The room beyond was dim curtains drawn against the afternoon sun. As her eyes adjusted, Ginny made out the shapes of furniture: a small bed, a toy chest, a child-sized rocking chair. But it was the walls that caught her attention. They were covered with drawings, colorful, vibrant sketches of animals, landscapes, and fantastical creatures, clearly the work of a child, but showing remarkable talent. On a small table sat several musical instruments, a tin whistle, a small wooden flute, and a child-sized violin, dusty from disuse, but lovingly arranged. A shelf held books of music theory far too advanced for a young child, their spines cracked from frequent reading. On the wall hung a framed portrait of a woman holding a little boy, both smiling at the artist. The woman was beautiful with warm eyes and dark hair, arranged in a style fashionable several years ago. The child, perhaps 8 or 9, had his mother's smile and what appeared to be his father's gray eyes. Clara and their son Ginny realized. Nate's family. She was about to retreat when she noticed a composition book open on the desk filled with musical notation in a child's careful hand. The title at the top read, "James's Lullaby for Mother." That was James's room. Ginny gasped, spinning around to find Nate standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "I'm so sorry," she stammered. "I shouldn't have." "No, you shouldn't have," he agreed, his voice flat. "But since you have, you might as well know the whole story." He stepped into the room and pulled back the curtains, letting light flood the space. Dust motes danced in the sunbeams, emphasizing how long the room had been undisturbed. Clara and James died 3 years ago. Fever took them both within a week of each other. His voice was controlled, but Ginny could hear the pain beneath the composure. James was 12, loved music more than anything, played 4 instruments by the time he was 10. "I'm sorry for your loss," Ginny said softly, knowing the words were inadequate, but having nothing better to offer. Nate nodded, acknowledging her sympathy without accepting it. His gaze lingered on the portrait. "Clara was a pianist too, taught music in Sacramento before we married. She used to say that music was her conversation with Mom." Ginny's heart ached for him, for the man who had preserved his son's room like a shrine, who still spoke of his wife with such raw pain in his voice. "I haven't been in here much since," Nate continued almost to himself. "Couldn't bear to change anything, but couldn't bear to see it either." He turned to Ginny, his expression hardening into resolve. "But that's no excuse for not being clear with you from the start. This house has ghosts, Miss Caldwell. Not the kind that rattle chains, but the kind that live in memory. You should know that if you're going to stay here." "I understand," Ginny said, "and I truly am sorry for intruding." Nate seemed to come back to himself, then straightening his shoulders and closing off his expression. "Supper in an hour, kitchen's through the door beside the fireplace. You'll find provisions in the pantry." He left without another word, closing the door behind him with quiet finality. Ginny stood alone in James's preserved bedroom, feeling like an intruder in more ways than one. She had stepped not just into a private space, but into the raw wound of Nate's grief, a grief he clearly had not resolved despite the passing years. As she quietly left the room, closing the door respectfully behind her, Ginny wondered what other secrets Lone Pine Ranch held, and whether she had jumped from one dangerous situation into another of a completely different nature. That night, long after Nate had retired to his room, Ginny sat alone at Clara's piano. The house had settled into silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the timbers cooling in the night air. Outside, a chorus of crickets sang their eternal summer song, accompanied by the soft rushing of the creek. Her fingers moved over the keys without pressing them, tracing patterns only she could see. It had been months since she'd played properly, not since that last desperate night in Philadelphia when she'd packed what little she could carry and fled into the darkness. The memory of that night rose unbidden, the urgent knocking at the door, the whispered warning from her father's former orderly, the letter clutched in her trembling hand revealing that Elijah Walker was building a case against her. Run, Miss Caldwell. Run tonight. Ginny shook her head, trying to dislodge the memory. That was behind her now. She was in Nevada, hundreds of miles from Philadelphia, and the accusations that had driven her west. Yet Blackwell's words at the auction echoed in her mind. Maybe he doesn't know about her terrible secret. How had he known? Who had told him about her past? With a deep breath, she pressed down on the keys, the opening notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major filling the room. The piano was indeed out of tune, but not terribly so, and her fingers remembered every note despite the months of silence. As she played, something inside her began to uncoil, a tightly wound spring of fear and sorrow gradually releasing with each measure. The music flowed from her fingertips, carrying away the humiliation of the auction block, the uncertainty of her future, the lingering dread of discovery. For these few precious moments, she was not Virginia Caldwell, fugitive daughter of a disgraced colonel, but simply a musician speaking the universal language of melody and harmony. Unknown to her, Nate stood in the shadows of the hallway listening. The familiar sound of the piano brought back memories so vivid they almost drove him to his knees. Clara playing the same instrument, James dancing around the room, his own younger self watching his family with a contentment he had never imagined possible. But the music was different now. Where Clara had played with technical precision, Ginny played with raw emotion, her soul evident in every note. The melody spoke of loss of dignity in the face of hardship, of resilience, things Nate understood all too well. He remained in the shadows until the final notes faded, then retreated silently to his room, leaving Ginny alone with her music and her thoughts. The following morning, Nate was already gone when Ginny came downstairs. A note on the kitchen table, written in a strong, angular hand, informed her that he would be working with the cattle on the north pasture and would return by midday. She was welcome to explore the house and immediate grounds, but advised to stay clear of the corral where a new stallion was being broken. Ginny spent the morning becoming acquainted with her new surroundings. The kitchen was well equipped by frontier standards, with a cast iron stove, a sink with a pump for water, and shelves of provisions. The pantry was stocked with flour, sugar, coffee, and other staples, along with jars of preserved fruits and vegetables. After preparing herself a simple breakfast, she set about cleaning the main room, dusting the bookshelves, and sweeping the wooden floors. As she worked, she found herself drawn to the family portrait hanging above the fireplace. Nate, Clara, and James, dressed in their Sunday best, posed formally, but with genuine smiles. They looked happy, a complete family unit, untouched by the tragedy that would later tear them apart. It was while dusting Nate's desk in the corner that she made the discovery. Tucked between the pages of an account book was a yellowed newspaper clipping from the Washington Chronicle dated 1864. The headline read, "Presidential Reception Honors Wounded Officers." Ginny's heart skipped a beat when she saw the photograph accompanying the article. There, standing side by side, were her father and Nathaniel Harrison, both in uniform, both looking considerably younger. They were shaking hands with President Lincoln at a White House reception for officers wounded in battle. The caption identified them, Colonel William Caldwell and Major Nathaniel Harrison, decorated for valor at Antietam, greet the president. Ginny sank into Nate's chair, staring at the image. Her father and Nate had known each other. They hadn't just served in the same army. They had been acquainted, perhaps even friends. And yet Nate had said nothing when he purchased her at the auction. He had given no indication that he recognized her name or knew of her connection to Colonel Caldwell. Why? What reason could he have for concealing such a connection? The sound of horses in the yard startled her from her thoughts. Quickly, she returned the clipping to its place and resumed her dusting, her mind racing with questions she wasn't sure she dared to ask. When Nate entered, bringing with him the sense of horse dust in the sage-filled air, Ginny was kneading dough for bread, her sleeves rolled up, and flour dusting her forearms. "You didn't need to do that," he said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "I want to earn my keep," she replied simply. "Besides, I find baking soothing." He nodded, accepting her explanation without comment. "How are you settling in Athene?" "Well enough," Ginny said, keeping her tone neutral. "Your home is lovely." Nate moved to the sink, washing his hands and face. Clara made it that way. I just maintain what she created. There it was again, that note of loss of a man living in the shadow of what once was. Ginny's fingers itched to play the piano to give voice to the emotions swirling in the air between them, but she remained at the kitchen table, pressing the heel of her hand into the dough with perhaps more force than necessary. I saw the portrait, she said carefully. Your family. You look happy. Nate dried his hands on a towel, his back to her. We were. The simplicity of his answer, the finality of it, closed the door on further conversation, as surely as if he had walked out of the room. Ginny returned her attention to the bread dough, sensing that any mention of the newspaper clipping would be unwelcome. Some secrets, it seemed, would have to wait for their revealing. The days settled into a rhythm. Nate rose before dawn to work the ranch with his two hired hands, Thomas and Frederick, who lived in a bunkhouse near the barn. Ginny prepared meals, cleaned the house, tended to the small kitchen garden, and gradually made herself indispensable in 100 small ways. In the evenings after supper had been cleared away, Nate would retreat to the porch with a pipe while Ginny played the piano. She never asked permission after that first night, and he never objected. It became their unspoken ritual, her music filling the spaces where words failed them both. It was during her second week at Lone Pine that the knock came at the door, surprising them both during the midday meal. Visitors were rare, especially unannounced ones. Nate rose from the table, his hand instinctively moving to the pistol he kept on a shelf by the door. Stay here, he instructed Ginny, his voice low. From the kitchen, she heard the door open, followed by a woman's voice, aged but strong. Mr. Harrison, I trust I'm not interrupting anything important. Mrs. Winters, Nate replied, surprise evident in his tone. This is unexpected. Life often is, young man. May I come in? The ride from town has left these old bones in need of a comfortable chair. Ginny stepped into the doorway as Nate ushered Margaret Winters into the main room. The elderly woman looked much as she had at the auction, dignified despite her years, her silver hair neatly arranged beneath a practical bonnet, her posture straight as a ramrod. Miss Caldwell. Margaret greeted her with a nod. I'm pleased to see you looking well. Lone Pine agrees with you, it seems. Mrs. Winters. Ginny returned the greeting, uncertain of the purpose behind this visit, but genuinely glad to see the woman who had shown her kindness when she most needed it. Would you like some tea? We were just having lunch. Tea would be lovely, thank you. As Ginny busied herself in the kitchen, she could hear the murmur of conversation from the main room. Margaret's clear, carrying voice, and Nate's deeper, more reserved responses. When she returned with the tea tray, the older woman was seated in one of the armchairs, while Nate stood by the fireplace, his posture tense. Ah, there you are, Margaret said, accepting the cup Ginny offered. Mr. Harrison and I were just discussing the state of education in Copper Creek. Most unsatisfactory, wouldn't you agree? Ginny glanced at Nate, trying to gauge his reaction to this unexpected topic. I wouldn't know, Mrs. Winters. I haven't had much opportunity to observe. Of course not. Margaret waved a hand dismissively. But you're a teacher, are you not, music specifically? I was, Ginny acknowledged, a pang of loss accompanying the admission. In Philadelphia. Well, that's precisely why I'm here. Margaret set her teacup down with a decisive click. Reverend Parker and I have been discussing the children's education. They learn their letters and numbers well enough from Miss Abernathy, but there's a deplorable lack of cultural refinement. The Reverend believes music is essential to a proper education. Ginny felt a spark of interest ignite within her. It is. Music teaches discipline, mathematics, history, language, all while nourishing the soul. Exactly. Margaret's eyes gleamed with triumph. Which is why we want you to teach music to the children of Copper Creek. The proposal hung in the air, unexpected and enticing. Ginny found herself speechless, torn between excitement at the prospect of teaching again and fear of the increased visibility it would bring. Mrs. Winters. Nate interjected, his voice carefully neutral. Miss Caldwell has only just arrived. She's still adjusting to life here. Nonsense, Margaret countered. What better way to adjust than to become part of the community? Besides, the lessons would only be on Sunday afternoons after services. Nothing elaborate, just basic instruction. Ginny looked to Nate, uncertain how to respond. Teaching music had been her profession in Philadelphia, her passion and purpose. The prospect of returning to it, even in this remote setting, sent a thrill of excitement through her. It's a generous offer, she said carefully. but I'm not sure it would be proper given the circumstances of my arrival in Copper Creek. Nonsense, Margaret interrupted. Half the people in this territory are running from something or someone. What matters is what you do now, not what brought you here. Nate, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. It's your decision, Jenny. If you want to teach, I won't stand in your way. His words, though supportive, carried an undercurrent Jenny couldn't quite identify. Was it concern, reluctance, or something deeper? I would need to come into town on Sundays, Jenny said, thinking through the practicalities. I'm not sure. I'll drive you, Nate said, his tone making it clear the matter was settled. I've been meaning to start attending services again anyway. Margaret's sharp eyes missed nothing of the exchange between them. Then it's decided. You'll start next Sunday. The children will be so excited. After Margaret departed, Jenny found Nate in the barn brushing down one of the horses with methodical strokes. You didn't have to agree to that, she said, leaning against the stall door. Taking me into town every Sunday will disrupt your work. Nate continued brushing his movements unhurried. The ranch won't fall apart if I take a few hours off once a week. Still, I'm grateful. Jenny hesitated, then asked the question that had been bothering her. Are you sure it's wise, though, for me to be so visible in town after what Mr. Blackwell said at the auction about my secret? Nate's hand stilled on the horse's flank. Blackwell talks a lot. Most of it's hot air. But if he knows something about my past, do you want to tell me what he might know? Nate interrupted, finally turning to face her. Because if there's trouble coming, I'd rather be prepared for it. Jenny's heart raced. The truth was too shameful, too dangerous to share, even with this man who had shown her nothing but decency. It's complicated, she said finally, and not something I'm ready to discuss. Nate studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes unreadable. Fair enough. We all have things we'd rather keep buried. He returned to brushing the horse. But just so you know, Jenny, whatever it is, I doubt it's as terrible as you think, and I doubt it would change my opinion of you. The simple statement, delivered without drama or expectation, touched something deep in Jenny's heart. For a moment, she was tempted to unburden herself to share the weight she had been carrying alone for so long. But fear held her back. Fear that once spoken, her shame would become real, and that the fragile peace she had found at Lone Pine would shatter like glass. Thank you, she said instead, for everything. Nate nodded, accepting her reticence without judgment. You should practice. If you're going to be teaching music again, you'll want to be sharp. The conversation was clearly over. Jenny retreated to the house, her thoughts in turmoil. Nate's willingness to support her teaching without knowing her full story both comforted and unsettled her. What would he think if he knew the truth? Would his opinion change then at the piano? Jenny lost herself in music, letting her fingers express what her words could not. The gratitude, the fear, the cautious hope that perhaps, just perhaps, she had found a place where she could begin again. Unknown to her, Nate stood once more in the shadows of the hallway listening. As the music washed over him, he made a decision. Whatever demons chased Virginia Caldwell, whatever secrets she kept, he would protect her. Not just because it was the right thing to do, but because in her presence, Clara's piano had come alive again. And with it, something in himself he had thought long dead. Jenny's first Sunday as a church music teacher was an unqualified success. The children, starved for cultural enrichment beyond their frontier education, flocked to her. Her natural ability with young people, combined with her genuine passion for music, won them over within minutes. Even the parents, some of whom had eyed her suspiciously during the church service, seemed to soften as they watched their children respond to her gentle instruction. By the end of the afternoon, several had approached her with awkward but sincere thanks. You've got a gift, Margaret commented as they watched the last of the children depart with their families. Those youngsters adore you already. Jenny smiled, warmed by the day's events. Music speaks to children in a special way. It gives them permission to feel deeply, to express things they might not have words for yet. Is that what it does for you? Margaret asked perceptively. Before Jenny could respond, the church door opened to admit a young girl, perhaps 8 years old, with solemn brown eyes and long blonde braids. She stood in the doorway, half hiding behind it, watching Jenny with an intensity that was almost unnerving. Sophia, come in, child. Margaret called, her voice gentling. No need to lurk in doorways. The girl entered hesitantly, her eyes never leaving Jenny's face. She carried a small cloth doll clutched tightly to her chest. Miss Caldwell, this is Sophia Martin, Margaret explained. She wasn't able to join the lesson today, but her aunt tells me she's very interested in music. Jenny smiled at the child, noting the wariness in her posture. Hello, Sophia. Would you like to come sit with me at the piano? Sophia didn't respond verbally, but after a moment's consideration, she approached the piano bench and perched on the edge beside Jenny. Sophia doesn't speak, Margaret said quietly. Not since the fire that took her mother last winter. Her father died in the war, so she lives with her aunt now. Jenny's heart constricted at the story. So much loss for one so young. That's all right, she said, addressing Sophia directly. Music is its own kind of talking. Sometimes it says things words can't. She played a simple melody, then gently took Sophia's small hand and guided it to the keys, helping her play a single note that harmonized with the tune. The girl's eyes widened slightly, and something like interest flickered across her solemn face. There, Jenny said softly. That's your voice in the music. Would you like to try another? Sophia nodded, the barest movement of her head, but a response nonetheless. For the next few minutes, Jenny guided her through a simple exercise, hitting notes to create a dialogue between them, Jenny's left hand playing a phrase, Sophia's finger responding with a single tone. Well, I never, Margaret murmured from where she stood watching. That's the most engaged I've seen her since the tragedy. As they finished the impromptu lesson, the church door opened again, this time admitting a well-dressed man with a neatly trimmed beard and the unmistakable bearing of Eastern breeding. He removed his hat upon entering, revealing dark hair streaked with premature silver at the temples. Ladies, he greeted them with a slight bow. Mrs. Winters, a pleasure as always. Mr. Walker, Margaret acknowledged coolly, I wasn't aware you attended services. Oh, I have a deep appreciation for redemption, the man replied, his gaze moving to Jenny. Speaking of which, I don't believe I've had the pleasure of meeting the new music teacher. A chill ran down Jenny's spine. Elijah Walker, here in Copper Creek, the very man whose threats had driven her from Philadelphia. Margaret, sensing her distress, stepped forward. Miss Caldwell, this is Mr. Elijah Walker. He arrived from back east a few days ago, ostensibly on mining business. Miss Caldwell, Walker said, his smile not reaching his eyes, a pleasure to make your acquaintance. I've heard so much about your musical talents. The deliberate emphasis he placed on the words made their meaning clear. This was no casual meeting, but a threat barely veiled. Mr. Walker, Jenny managed, fighting to keep her voice steady. Welcome to Copper Creek. Sophia, still seated beside Jenny, seemed to sense the tension. She pressed closer to Jenny's side, her small body rigid with apprehension. I understand you're staying at the Harrison Ranch. Walker continued, twirling his hat in his hands. Quite the unexpected arrangement, wouldn't you say? Mr. Harrison has been very kind, Jenny replied, her mouth dry with fear. Yes, I've heard he's a man of principle. Walker's gaze sharpened. Curious how fate brings people together, isn't it? One moment a respected music teacher in Philadelphia, the next shall we say, ward of a reclusive rancher in Nevada. Life takes unexpected turns. Margaret moved subtly to stand beside Jenny, her presence a silent show of support. Mr. Walker, if you have something to say, perhaps you should say it directly. Otherwise, Miss Caldwell and I have matters to attend to. Walker's smile tightened. Just making conversation, Mrs. Winters. No need to be defensive. He turned his attention back to Jenny. I do admire your resilience, Miss Caldwell. It's a quality my old friend William valued highly. The mention of her father's name sent a jolt through Jenny. Walker knew exactly who she was and wanted her to know it. Life takes unexpected turns for us all, Jenny replied, struggling to maintain her composure. Indeed it does. Walker settled his hat back on his head. And sometimes those turns bring us face to face with our past just when we think we've escaped it. With that parting shot that he exited the church, leaving a chill in his wake despite the warm summer air. Don't let him intimidate you, Margaret said, once the door had closed behind him. Elijah Walker has been in town less than a week, and already he's made himself unwelcome with his airs and insinuations. Jenny barely heard her, too focused on controlling the trembling that threatened to overtake her. Walker had found her. Her worst fear realized. A small, warm hand slipped into hers. Sophia looked up at her with those solemn eyes, squeezing her fingers in silent comfort. The simple gesture nearly undid Jenny's composure completely. Thank you, Sophia, she whispered, returning the gentle pressure. You're very brave, you know that. The girl ducked her head, but not before Ginny caught the ghost of a smile touching her lips. She likes you, Margaret observed. That's rare. Sophia doesn't take to many people these days. Before Ginny could respond, the church door opened once more, and Nate appeared, his expression darkening when he noted her distress. Everything all right? He asked, his gaze sweeping the church as if searching for threats. Just tired, Ginny assured him, forcing a smile. It's been a wonderful but exhausting day. Nate clearly didn't believe her, but didn't press the issue. Wagon's ready whenever you are. On the ride back to Lone Pine, Ginny was uncharacteristically quiet, her thoughts churning with Walker's implied threats. What did he know? How had he found her? And most importantly, what did he intend to do with the information? Nate, respecting her silence, focused on driving until they were well outside town. Finally, as the ranch came into view, he spoke. Walker bothered you. It wasn't a question, but Ginny answered anyway. Yes. What did he say? Ginny hesitated, torn between the desire to protect herself by keeping secrets and the growing awareness that Nate deserved to know what might be coming. He implied he knows why I left Philadelphia, she said finally, and suggested that my past might catch up with me. Nate's hands tightened on the reins. Is that likely? I don't know, Ginny admitted. I hoped that I'd left it all behind. But if Walker has been making inquiries, then I might need to be prepared. Nate finished for her. He was quiet for a moment, then added, Whatever it is, Ginny, I meant what I said before. This is your home now for as long as you want it to be. I won't turn you out because of something that happened before you came here. The simple declaration brought unexpected tears to Ginny's eyes. You can't promise that without knowing the truth. I know enough, Nate replied. I know you're kind to animals, patient with the learning difficult tasks, and that you gave those children today something they desperately needed. The rest is just details. His certainty both comforted and frightened Ginny. What would happen to that certainty if he knew she had been accused of treason, that in Philadelphia her name was whispered alongside words like traitor and Confederate sympathizer? The questions haunted her as they arrived at the ranch, following her through the evening routine and into the night. As she lay awake, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling and the distant calls of night creatures, Ginny made a decision. She would continue teaching, continue building this new life, and pray that Elijah Walker's threats were nothing more than cruel intimidation. But a part of her knew better. The past was never truly past. It was merely waiting for the right moment to reappear. And in the form of Elijah Walker, it had found her at last. A week passed since Elijah Walker's appearance at the church, each day a strange mixture of normalcy and tension. Ginny continued her duties at Lone Pine, finding unexpected solace in the rhythm of ranch life. The predictable progression of chores, the satisfaction of work completed the simple pleasure of watching the sun rise and set over the Nevada landscape. Yet beneath this veneer of routine, anxiety gnawed at her. Every approaching rider brought a surge of fear, every unexpected sound a moment of panic. She found herself watching the road from the window, starting at shadows, sleeping fitfully, despite the physical exhaustion that ranch work brought. Nate noticed the change in her, but said nothing, respecting her silence as she had respected his. Still, she caught him watching her with concern when he thought she wasn't looking. His gray eyes thoughtful beneath the brim of his hat. The piano became her refuge. Each evening after supper had been cleared away, she retreated to the instrument, losing herself in the familiar patterns of melody and harmony. Sometimes she played for hours until her fingers ached and her eyes grew heavy, as if the music could somehow hold the past at bay. On Saturday evening, as she played a melancholy Chopin prelude, Nate emerged from his room with a book in hand. Instead of retreating to the porch as was his custom, he settled in the armchair near the piano, opened his volume, and began to read by the light of the oil lamp. Surprised by this departure from routine, Ginny faltered briefly before continuing. Though no words passed between them, his presence felt like a statement, a quiet declaration that she was not alone in whatever storm approached. When she finally finished playing, the silence hung between them, not uncomfortable, but expectant. My mother played, Nate said, his voice low in the quiet room. Not as well as Clara, and certainly not as well as you, but she loved it. Said music was a window to the soul. Ginny turned on the bench to face him. This was the first time he had voluntarily shared anything of his past beyond Clara and James. She was right, Ginny replied. Music reveals what we can't or won't say aloud. Nate closed his book, a finger marking his place. And what is your music saying tonight, Jenny? The question asked with such gentle directness caught her off guard. She looked down at her hands still resting on the keys. That I'm afraid, she admitted, the words barely audible. That I've been running for so long, I'm not sure I remember how to stand still. Nate nodded, accepting her confession, without pressing for details she wasn't ready to share. Fear is a sensible response to danger. It keeps us alive. He paused, his gaze distant. But it's a cruel master if we let it rule us. How do you stop it? Jenny asked, genuinely wanting to know. A sad smile touched his lips. When you figure that out, I hope you'll tell me. The following morning dawned gray and heavy with the promise of rain. Nate and Jenny rode to town in silence, the wagon jolting over the rutted trail. The threat of storm seemed to hang in the air, both meteorological and metaphorical, as if nature herself was responding to the tension building within and around them. Copper Creek appeared subdued under the leaden sky. Few people moved along the main street as Nate guided the wagon to the hitching post outside the church. The building stood silent and waiting, its white-painted exterior stark against the darkening clouds. I'll come for you after the service, Nate said as he helped Jenny down from the wagon. I have some business with Dr. Montgomery. Jenny nodded, grateful that he wouldn't be sitting through the service. She felt exposed enough without having him witness the sidelong glances and whispered comments that had greeted her entrance the previous Sunday. The church filled slowly as the hour approached. Families arrived in groups, shaking out umbrellas and removing rain-spattered hats. Jenny stood near the piano reviewing the music for the service when she felt a tug at her skirt. Sophia Martin looked up at her with those solemn eyes, her blonde braids damp from the light rain that had begun to fall. Beside her stood a tired-looking woman in her 30s, presumably the Aunt Margaret had mentioned. Miss Caldwell, the woman greeted her with a nod. I'm Sarah Turner, Sophia's aunt. She insisted on coming early to see you, though I told her you'd be busy preparing. Not too busy for Sophia, Jenny replied, smiling at the girl. Would you like to help me arrange the music? Sophia nodded, her face serious as Jenny handed her several sheets to hold. Together they organized the hymns for the service, Sophia watching intently as Jenny explained the order and purpose of each piece. Though the child never spoke, her eyes were communicative, brightening with interest when Jenny demonstrated a particularly beautiful chord progression. As the congregation settled into the pews, Jenny took her place at the piano. The service proceeded as expected, with Reverend Parker delivering a sermon on forgiveness that seemed particularly pointed in a community where grudges were nursed like precious heirlooms. Throughout the service, Jenny was acutely aware of Sophia's gaze fixed on her from the third pew, where she sat beside her aunt. There was something in the child's intensity that went beyond ordinary interest, something almost like recognition, though Jenny was certain they had never met before her arrival in Copper Creek. After the final hymn, as the congregation began to disperse, Jenny gathered the children for their music lesson. 10 students, ranging in age from 6 to 14, assembled near the piano, including Sophia, who positioned herself at the very edge of the group, half hidden behind an older girl. Today, Jenny announced, we're going to learn about how music tells stories without words. She played a simple, cheerful melody, then asked what story the children heard in it. Answers came quickly: a spring morning, a birthday celebration, a dance. Next, she shifted to a slow minor key progression. And this one sounds sad, offering a freckled boy of about 10, like someone crying, added a girl with pigtails. Jenny nodded encouragingly. Music speaks to our emotions. It can make us feel happy or sad, brave or afraid without saying a single word. She continued the lesson, introducing the children to different musical moods and encouraging them to express what each made them feel. Boys participated enthusiastically, calling out their impressions or raising hands to be called upon. Sophia remained silent, but her eyes never left Jenny's hands on the keyboard. When Jenny played a particularly poignant melody, one that James Harrison had composed, though she didn't share this information, the girl's expression changed subtly, a flicker of something like recognition crossing her features. As the lesson concluded, the children gathered their things and returned to waiting parents. Sophia lingered, her aunt engaged in conversation with Margaret Winters near the church door. Did you enjoy the lesson? Jenny asked, kneeling to meet the child at eye level. Sophia nodded, then hesitantly reached for the piano keys. Her small fingers picked out 3 notes, the opening of James's melody that Jenny had played earlier. Ginny's breath caught. You know that song? The girl didn't respond, but played the three notes again, this time adding a fourth that continued the phrase correctly. That's right, Ginny said, astonished. How do you? Sophia, time to go, child, Sarah Turner called from the doorway. Sophia withdrew her hand from the piano as if burned, casting one last glance at Ginny before hurrying to her aunt's side. They departed quickly, leaving Ginny kneeling by the piano, confusion mingling with a strange sense of disquiet. How had Sophia known James's melody? The piece wasn't published. It existed only in the boy's composition book that Ginny had found in his room. Yet Sophia had played it with the certainty of familiarity, adding the correct note to continue the phrase. Before she could pursue this mystery further, the church door opened again, admitting a gust of rain-laden wind and Judd Blackwell. He entered with the confidence of a man who believed himself welcome everywhere, despite evidence to the contrary. Miss Caldwell, he greeted her, removing his hat to reveal hair slicked with pomade. Quite the little musical gathering you've established. Ginny rose from her kneeling position, instinctively putting the piano bench between them. Mr. Blackwell, I wasn't aware you had children in the parish. My interest in education is civic rather than paternal, he replied, moving further into the church. Water dripped from his expensive coat onto the wooden floor. As the most successful businessman in Copper Creek, I consider it my duty to remain informed about all community activities. How conscientious of you, Ginny said, unable to keep a note of sarcasm from her voice. Blackwell's smile didn't waver. I've always found it prudent to know what's happening in my town. For instance, I know that you and Mr. Walker are acquainted from Philadelphia. The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Ginny fought to keep her expression neutral. Mr. Walker introduced himself last Sunday. Beyond that, I'm afraid there's little to tell. Come now, Miss Caldwell. There's no need for pretense between us. Blackwell moved closer, his voice dropping. I know all about the Caldwell scandal. Quite the sensation in Eastern papers, wasn't it? A Union colonel accused of passing information to the Confederacy, his daughter implicated in the treasonous correspondence. Cold fear washed over Ginny. So it was true. Blackwell knew her story, or at least the version that had been spread by her father's enemies. You seem remarkably well informed for someone so far from Philadelphia, she managed. Information is a commodity like any other, Blackwell replied, available to those willing to pay for it. He twirled his hat in his hands, a gesture reminiscent of Walker. I wonder what the good people of Copper Creek would think if they knew they'd entrusted their children's musical education to the daughter of a traitor. My father was not a traitor, Ginny said, her voice low but fierce. And neither am I. A matter of perspective, perhaps. The courts in Philadelphia might disagree. What do you want, Mr. Blackwell? His smile widened, revealing teeth too perfect to be natural. Merely to offer some friendly advice. Your position here is precarious, Miss Caldwell. One word in the right ear, and you'll find yourself facing the same hostility that drove you from Philadelphia. Is that a threat? A prediction? Unless, of course, you were to persuade your benefactor to reconsider his stance on certain matters. Understanding dawned. This is about Nate, about Lone Pine. Blackwell inclined his head slightly. Major Harrison sits on the Water Rights Commission. His vote has blocked my expansion plans 3 times in the past year. Perhaps you could help him see reason. And if I can't, then I fear your past will become very public knowledge. Blackwell settled his hat back on his head. Consider your options, Miss Caldwell. I'll expect an answer by week's end. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. Oh, and you might ask your silent admirer where she learned that melody. Young Sophia has quite the interesting connection to your current situation. More than you know. With that cryptic remark, he departed, leaving Ginny alone in the church, the sound of rain on the roof suddenly deafening in the silence. By the time Nate returned to collect her, Ginny had composed herself outwardly, though her mind raced with Blackwell's threats and his puzzling comment about Sophia. The ride back to Lone Pine was subdued, the rain having intensified to a steady downpour that drummed on the wagon's canvas cover and turned the trail to mud. Bad weather for it. Nate observed his first words since they'd left town. Ginny murmured agreement, watching raindrops chase each other down the canvas. Did the lesson go well? Yes, she replied. Then hesitated. Should she tell him about Blackwell's visit, about the threats and demands? Part of her wanted to unburden herself to share the weight of worry that pressed down on her. But another part, trained by months of secrecy and years of her father's cautious teachings, held back. You're quiet today. Nate noted his eyes on the rain-slicked trail. Just thinking. About Ginny sighed, deciding on a partial truth. Sophia Martin. There's something unusual about her. Nate nodded. Dr. Montgomery mentioned her. Hasn't spoken since her mother died in the fire. Tragic business. She played a melody today, Ginny said carefully. One she shouldn't know. Children pick up tunes quickly. Not this one. Ginny turned to face him directly. It was James's composition, the lullaby I found in his room. Nate's hands tightened on the reins, the only indication that her words had affected him. That's not possible. James's music was never published, never performed outside our home. Nevertheless, she played it, the beginning at least. Silence fell between them, broken only by the steady patter of rain and the splash of the horse's hooves through puddles. Finally, Nate spoke, his voice thoughtful. Sophia's mother, Ellen, was a friend of Clara's. They met when Clara gave piano lessons in town before. He trailed off, then continued more firmly. They visited the ranch occasionally. Perhaps Sophia heard James play it then. Perhaps, Ginny agreed, though something in the explanation felt incomplete. Mr. Blackwell seemed to think there was more to it. He mentioned a connection between Sophia and my situation. Nate's head turned sharply. Blackwell spoke to you when, after the lesson, he came to the church. What did he want? Ginny hesitated, then decided to reveal the full truth. He knows about the accusations against my father and me in Philadelphia. He threatened to make them public unless I persuade you to change your vote on the Water Rights Commission. Nate was silent for a long moment, his profile stern against the gray light filtering through the wagon's canvas. I see. I'm sorry, Ginny said quietly. I've brought trouble to your door. The trouble was already there, Nate replied. Blackwell has been trying to control the water rights in this valley for years. Your situation just gave him a new lever to try. What will you do? What will we do, you mean? Nate glanced at her, his expression softening slightly. This involves both of us now. The inclusion, the simple we, where she had expected I, touched Ginny deeply. For so long, she had been alone with her fears, her secrets, her shame. To have Nate stand beside her rather than apart from her was unexpectedly moving. We'll weather this, he continued, turning his attention back to the trail. Blackwell's threats are just that, threats, words, not actions. But if he tells people about the accusations, then we'll face that when it comes. Nate's voice held a certainty that Ginny wished she could share. For now, let's get home before this rain washes out the trail completely. Home. The word echoed in Ginny's mind as they continued through the downpour. When had Lone Pine transformed from the ranch or Nate's house to home in her thoughts? And how much would it hurt when not if, but when she was forced to leave it behind? The rain continued through the night and into the following day, keeping them housebound. Nate spent the morning at his desk working on accounts and writing letters, while Ginny baked bread and prepared a stew for the evening meal. The domesticity of the scene might have been comforting under different circumstances, but the specter of Blackwell's threats hung over them, an invisible presence at every moment. By afternoon, the rain had slackened to a drizzle, and Nate announced his intention to check on the cattle in the north pasture. The creek rises quickly in weather like this, he explained as he pulled on his oilskin coat. I need to make sure they haven't been cut off by flooding. After he departed, Ginny found herself restless, unable to settle to any task for long. She tried reading but couldn't focus on the words. She attempted to play the piano, but found her fingers stiff and uncooperative. Finally, she decided to sort through the mending basket, a mindless task that might occupy her hands, if not her troubled thoughts. As she worked, thunder rumbled in the distance, a reminder that the storm had not fully passed. The house creaked and settled around her, its familiar sounds now overlaid with a tension that had nothing to do with the weather. A sharp knock at the door startled her so badly that she pricked her finger with the needle, drawing a bead of blood. Setting aside the mending, she approached the door, cautiously aware that Nate was still out with the cattle and unlikely to return for hours. Who is it? She called, one hand on the latch. Dr. Isaac Montgomery, came the reply, slightly muffled by the door and the sound of rain. I've a message from Nate. Relieved, Ginny opened the door to admit a man in his 50s, rain dripping from his hat and coat. She had seen him at church but hadn't been formally introduced. Dr. Montgomery, please come in. Let me take your coat. Thank you, Miss Caldwell. He surrendered his wet outer garments, revealing a lean frame and a face lined with experience rather than age. His eyes, sharp and assessing behind wire-rimmed spectacles, took in the room with a single glance before settling on her. I apologize for arriving unannounced, but the matter seemed urgent. Is Nate all right? Ginny asked, sudden fear clutching at her heart. He's fine as far as I know, the doctor assured her. This concerns another matter entirely. May we sit? Ginny led him to the sitting area, her anxiety only slightly alleviated. Can I offer you tea, coffee? Coffee would be welcome if it's not too much trouble. It's a miserable day to be on the road. While Ginny prepared the coffee, Dr. Montgomery removed a folded paper from his waistcoat pocket, studying it with a frown. When she returned with two steaming cups, he accepted one with a nod of thanks, but made no move to unfold the paper. Miss Caldwell, he began, his tone measured. I've known Nate Harrison for nearly a decade. He's a private man, not given to sharing his concerns easily, but he trusts me both as his physician and I like to think as his friend. Ginny nodded, uncertain where this was leading. This morning he asked me to make some inquiries about a man named Elijah Walker. What can you tell me about him? The question, so direct and unexpected, caught Ginny off guard. She set down her coffee cup to hide the trembling of her hands. Not much, she said carefully. He's from Philadelphia. I believe he's here on mining business. On Dr. Montgomery's gaze was shrewd. And his connection to you? Why do you ask? Because the doctor said patiently, Nate is concerned for your safety. And because Mr. Walker has been seen conferring with Judd Blackwell at the Silver Crown, which is rarely a good sign for anyone in this valley. Ginny looked down at her hands, now clasped tightly in her lap. The weight of secrecy pressed down on her, a burden grown heavier with each passing day. Perhaps it was time to share it, at least partially. Mr. Walker was my father's business partner, she said finally. They had a falling out over politics during the war. After my father's death, he became one of those who accused us of disloyalty to the Union. Dr. Montgomery nodded as if this confirmed something he already suspected. And now he's found you here. Yes, I see. The doctor unfolded the paper at last. This arrived on yesterday's stage. It's a telegram from a colleague in Philadelphia responding to my inquiries about Walker. He handed the paper to Ginny, who read it with growing dread. Walker departed Philadelphia. Stop. Federal marshals seeking him for questioning. Stop. Suspected embezzlement from Caldwell Estate. Stop. Exercise caution. Stop. Regards, Jenkins. Embezzlement, Ginny whispered, shock reverberating through her. From my father's estate. It appears Mr. Walker may have been helping himself to funds he was entrusted to manage, Dr. Montgomery said grimly, which might explain his eagerness to discredit you and your father. Dead men and fugitive daughters make convenient scapegoats. Ginny read the telegram again, her mind racing. Could it be true? Had Walker been stealing from the estate all along, using the accusations of treason to cover his theft? It would explain his desperation to find her, to silence her before she could return to Philadelphia and discover the truth. There's more, Dr. Montgomery continued. My friend in Carson City tells me Walker has been meeting with a man named Howard Pinkerton, not of the famous detective agency, but a disreputable sort who specializes in finding people who don't wish to be found. A bounty hunter of a kind. He means to take me back, Ginny said, voicing the fear that had haunted her since seeing Walker in the church. To Philadelphia to face the accusations. So it would seem. The doctor leaned forward, his expression grave. Miss Caldwell, I don't know the full story of what happened in Philadelphia, and I don't need to, but I do know that Nate considers you under his protection, which means you're under mine as well. If Walker and Blackwell are plotting against you, we need to be prepared. What can we do? For now, vigilance. I've informed Sheriff Taylor of my suspicions regarding Walker, though without specifying your involvement. He'll keep an eye on him. De Montgomery's mouth twisted in a wry smile. The sheriff has no love for Blackwell, which works in our favor. Ginny nodded, grateful for this unexpected alliance, but still frightened. Thank you, Dr. Montgomery. Isaac, please. If we're to be co-conspirators, we might as well dispense with formalities. He rose, gathering his hat and coat. I should return to town before the rain worsens again. Tell Nate I'll see him Tuesday at the Water Commission meeting. And Miss Caldwell. Ginny, she corrected automatically. Ginny Bummer, he acknowledged with a slight smile. Be careful. Walker strikes me as a man with little to lose, which is the most dangerous kind. After the doctor departed, Ginny stood at the window watching the rain trace patterns on the glass. The revelations about Walker had shaken her deeply. If he had been embezzling from her father's estate, it changed everything: her understanding of the past, her assessment of present dangers, her hopes for the future. She had fled Philadelphia believing herself guilty by association, tainted by her father's supposed treason. But what if there had been no treason? What if the accusations had been manufactured by Walker to cover his own crimes? The possibility was both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it suggested her father might be vindicated, his name cleared of dishonor. Terrifying because it meant Walker had even more reason to silence her permanently. Lost in these thoughts, she didn't hear Nate's return until the door opened, admitting a gust of damp air and the smell of wet wool and horse. He stamped his boots on the threshold, removing his dripping hat and coat. "Storm's passing," he announced, hanging his things by the door. "Creek's high, but not flooding yet." He paused, noting her expression. "What's wrong?" "Dr. Montgomery was here," Ginny said, retrieving the telegram from where she'd left it on the side table. "He brought this." Nate read the message, his face darkening. "Embezzlement. That explains a few things." "You're not surprised. I've known men like Walker. They wrap themselves in righteousness while picking their neighbors' pockets." Nate handed the telegram back to her. "What else did Isaac say?" Ginny relayed the doctor's information about Howard Pinkerton and his conversation with the sheriff, watching Nate's expression grow more troubled with each detail. "We'll need to be more careful," he said when she finished. "No more riding into town alone. No wandering the property without letting me know where you are." The protectiveness in his voice warmed Ginny even as she chafed at the restrictions. "I won't be a prisoner, Nate, not even for my own safety." "Not a prisoner," he agreed, "but prudent. Walker is desperate now, and Blackwell has never been one to accept defeat gracefully. Together, they're a dangerous combination." Ginny couldn't argue with his assessment. Instead, she moved to the kitchen, busying herself with preparations for their evening meal. Nate followed, leaning against the doorframe as she worked. "There's something else," he said after a moment. "Something I should have told you before now." Ginny looked up from the vegetables she was chopping, a sense of foreboding creeping over her. "What is it?" Nate seemed to struggle with himself, the internal conflict visible in the tightness around his eyes, the set of his jaw. Finally, he straightened, decision made. "I knew your father." Though Ginny had suspected as much since finding the newspaper clipping, hearing the admission aloud sent a shock through her system. She set down the knife carefully, afraid her suddenly trembling hands might cause an accident. "I know," she said quietly. "I found the photograph. You and my father with President Lincoln." Surprise flickered across Nate's face. "You found, and you didn't say anything." "Neither did you." A hint of accusation crept into her voice. "Why, Nate? Why keep it secret?" He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration Ginny had come to recognize. "It's complicated." "Uncomplicated," she insisted, her patience suddenly at an end. "After everything that's happened, don't you think I deserve the truth?" Nate met her gaze directly. "Yes, you do." He drew a deep breath. "Your father saved my life at Antietam. My regiment was cut off, surrounded. We were being decimated. Colonel Caldwell led a counterattack that drove back the Confederate forces long enough for us to retreat to safer ground." Ginny listened in stunned silence. Her father had rarely spoken of specific battles and never of men he had saved. "He was wounded in the process," Nate continued. "Not seriously, but enough that I helped carry him to the field hospital. We talked during those hours. He showed me a photograph he carried his family back in Philadelphia. His wife and his daughter, a young woman at a piano." Nate's gray eyes, when they met hers, were filled with a complexity of emotion she couldn't fully decipher. "You. I recognized you the moment I saw you on that auction block, though it took me time to place why you seem familiar. You've changed since that photograph, but your eyes are the same." Ginny's world tilted on its axis. Nate hadn't purchased her freedom on a charitable impulse, or even out of kindness. He had done it because of a debt to her father, a debt of life. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "At first I wasn't certain it was you," Nate admitted. "And then I didn't know how to explain without telling you everything about your father, about the promise I made him." "Promise?" Nate's jaw tightened. "The last thing he said to me before they took him away was, 'If you ever meet my Ginny, watch over her for me.' I thought it was just the rambling of a man in pain, something he'd never remember saying. I never expected to actually encounter you, especially not in Copper Creek. The revelation left Ginny breathless. All this time she had been living with a man who had known her father, who had made a promise to him, a promise he had kept without ever revealing why. So when you saw me at the auction, I knew I had to honor that promise, Nate finished. I couldn't leave the daughter of the man who saved my life to be sold to someone like Blackwell. Ginny sat in stunned silence, processing this new reality. The kindness she had attributed to Nate's character, and which was genuinely part of him, had been initially motivated by an old battlefield promise. It wasn't that he had seen her worth as a person, he had seen her as an obligation to be fulfilled. The thought stung more than she expected. I see, she said finally, her voice cooled despite her efforts to hide her hurt. Well, you've certainly fulfilled your obligation admirably, Mr. Harrison. I'm sure my father would be grateful. Nate winced at her formal tone. Ginny, it wasn't just about the promise. That's why I acted initially, yes, but these past weeks getting to know you. Please, she interrupted, unable to bear whatever he might say next. I understand perfectly. You've been very kind and I'm grateful. But I think we both know that kindness had its limits. You never intended for me to stay permanently, did you? Once your debt to my father was paid, once I was safely established, you would have considered your obligation fulfilled. That's not true, Nate protested. But the flush on his cheekbones told Ginny she had struck close to a truth he hadn't even admitted to himself. It doesn't matter, she said, fighting to maintain her composure. What matters is that I understand our arrangement better now, and I think it's best if I accelerate my plans to move on. Nate looked stricken. Move on, Ginny, there's no need. There is, she insisted, cutting him off again. I appreciate everything you've done, truly. But I can't stay knowing that I'm just an obligation, a promise to be kept. Nate opened his mouth to respond, but a sudden pounding at the door interrupted him. They both turned, startled by the urgent sound. Stay here, Nate ordered, his hand moving to the rifle kept by the door. He crossed the room in a few quick strides, positioning himself to the side of the entrance before calling out, Who's there? Thomas, boss, came the muffled reply. Riders coming, armed men, at least 5 of them. Nate threw open the door to admit his ranch hand, a weathered man in his 40s whose usual stoic expression was replaced by one of genuine alarm. Where? Nate demanded. Coming up the main trail from town. Thomas reported, water dripping from his hat onto the floor. Frederick's watching them from the ridge. He sent me to warn you. How far out? 10 minutes, maybe less. They're pushing hard despite the weather. Nate's face hardened into the mask of the soldier he had once been. Get back to Frederick. Tell him to fall back to the barn but stay out of sight. I want to know when they arrive, but I don't want them to know we've been warned. Thomas nodded and disappeared back into the rain, leaving the door open behind him. Nate closed it firmly, then turned to Ginny. We have to assume it's Walker and Blackwell, he said, his voice now deadly calm. Probably with Pinkerton and hired guns. They'll try to take you by force. Fear clutched at Ginny's throat, but she forced it down. What do we do? We need to get you somewhere safe. Nate moved to his desk, unlocking a drawer and removing a small pistol. Do you know how to use this? Ginny nodded. Her father had insisted she learn another of his lessons she'd once found excessive, but now appreciated. Point and squeeze, not pull. Keep both eyes open. Good. Nate handed her the weapon. It's loaded 5 shots. Use it only if you have no choice. He crossed to the window, peering out at the rain-soaked yard. There's a root cellar behind the smokehouse. The entrance is hidden under a pile of firewood. It's small but dry and secure. I'm not hiding in a hole while you face them alone, Ginny protested. You will if that's what it takes to keep you safe. Nate countered his tone, brooking no argument. He softened slightly at her expression. Ginny, these men aren't coming to talk. They're coming to take you by any means necessary. I promised your father I'd protect you, and that's exactly what I intend to do. The promise again. Always the promise, never the person. Ginny felt something harden inside her, a resolve born of hurt and fear, and a lifetime of being underestimated. No, she said firmly. I won't run and I won't hide. If Walker wants me, let him come and try to take me. But he'll find I'm not the helpless girl he remembers. Nate stared at her, clearly torn between admiration and frustration. This isn't the time for bravado. It's not bravado, Ginny insisted. It's survival. I've been running for months, Nate. Always looking over my shoulder, always afraid. I'm tired of it. If this ends today, then let it end with me facing my accusers, not cowering in a root cellar. A long moment passed as they regarded each other, the sound of rain on the roof marking the seconds. Finally, Nate nodded a reluctant acceptance of her decision. All right, but we do this my way. You stay inside away from the windows. I'll meet them in the yard. Before Jenny could respond, a shrill whistle cut through the patter of rain, Thomas's signal that the riders had arrived. Nate moved to the window again, his expression grim. 5 of them, he confirmed. Walker Blackwell and 3 others I don't recognize, all armed. He retrieved his rifle from its place by the door, checking the load with practiced efficiency. Remember, stay away from the windows. If shooting starts, get down on the floor. With that, he stepped out onto the porch, closing the door firmly behind him. Ginny moved to the window despite his warning, positioning herself to see without being easily visible. The 5 riders sat their horses in the yard, rain streaming from their hats and coats. Elijah Walker and Judd Blackwell were in front, flanked by 3 rough-looking men whose hands rested near holstered pistols. One, a narrow-faced individual with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, had to be Howard Pinkerton. "Harrison," Blackwell called, his voice carrying through the rain. "We've come to speak with Miss Caldwell." Nate stood on the porch, rifle held casually but ready. "Miss Caldwell isn't receiving visitors today. State your business with me." Walker urged his horse forward a few steps. "Our business is with Virginia Caldwell, not you, Major. There are legal matters in Philadelphia requiring her attention. Any legal matters can be addressed through proper channels," Nate replied evenly. "Not by armed men appearing at my door uninvited. We have authorization to return her to Philadelphia," Walker insisted, reaching into his coat and producing a folded document. "A warrant for her arrest on charges of treason against the United States." From her vantage point, Ginny couldn't see the document clearly, but doubt gnawed at her. Was it genuine? Had official charges finally been filed? Or was this another of Walker's deceptions? "That paper means nothing here," Nate said, unmoved. "This is Nevada territory, not Pennsylvania. If you have a valid warrant, take it to Sheriff Taylor in Copper Creek. Let him determine its legitimacy. We don't have time for such formalities." Walker snapped his composure, cracking. "Miss Caldwell has evaded justice for too long already. She will return with us today, voluntarily or otherwise." The threat hung in the rain-heavy air, clear and unmistakable. Pinkerton and the other 2 men shifted in their saddles, hands moving closer to their weapons. "I think not," Nate replied, his voice deceptively calm. "Miss Caldwell is under my protection. Any attempt to remove her from this property will be met with force." Blackwell's laugh was ugly. "You against the 5 of us? Poor odds, Harrison, even for a decorated officer." 3 to 5, came a new voice from the direction of the barn. Thomas and Frederick emerged, rifles trained on the visitors. "Still poor odds, but considerably improved." Ginny's heart raced as she watched the standoff from the window. The situation balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong move, one hasty word, and violence would erupt, with Nate and his men badly outnumbered, despite their strategic positioning. She couldn't let that happen. Couldn't let Nate risk his life and the lives of Thomas and Frederick for a promise made to a dying man years ago. This was her fight, not theirs. Before she could reconsider, Ginny opened the door and stepped onto the porch beside Nate. "That's enough," she called, her voice steady despite her fear. "I'll speak with Mr. Walker." Nate turned to her, anger and concern warring in his expression. "Ginny, get back inside." "No," she kept her eyes on Walker, noting the triumph that flashed across his face. "This has gone far enough. Too many people have suffered because of these accusations. It's time to end it." Walker dismounted, the document still clutched in his hand. "A wise decision, Miss Caldwell. Come with us peacefully, and no one need be harmed." "I'll hear what you have to say," Ginny replied, moving down the porch steps despite Nate's attempt to block her path. "But I'm not going anywhere until I do." She stopped at the bottom of the steps, rain soaking through her dress, her hair running down her face like tears she refused to shed. Walker approached, triumph written in every line of his posture. "The charges are serious," he said, holding out the document. "Treason, conspiracy, aiding the enemy during time of war. The courts in Philadelphia will not be lenient." Ginny took the paper, unfolding it with fingers that refused to tremble. The text was dense legal language stamped with what appeared to be an official seal. "And what of your crimes, Mr. Walker?" she asked, raising her voice to be heard over the rain. "The embezzlement from my father's estate. Will the courts be lenient with you when that comes to light?" Walker's expression froze, then twisted with rage. "Lies. Desperate slander from a traitor's daughter." "Not lies," came yet another voice, deep and authoritative. From the tree line emerged a solidly built man wearing a sheriff's badge, accompanied by Dr. Montgomery and two deputies. "Federal marshals in Carson City are quite interested in your financial activities, Mr. Walker." "As am I." Sheriff Taylor moved forward, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "Dr. Montgomery shared some interesting information with me yesterday. Seems there's a telegram from Philadelphia mentioning your name in connection with missing funds." Walker's face drained of color. "This is absurd. I've done nothing wrong. The warrant—" "May I see that document, Miss Caldwell?" The sheriff interrupted, extending his hand. Jenny passed him the paper, watching as he examined it with a frown that deepened by the second. "This," he said finally, "is not a valid federal warrant. The seal is forged, and the signature purports to be from Judge Hamilton Webster, who, as it happens, died last year." He folded the paper and tucked it into his coat. "Mr. Walker, Mr. Blackwell, I'm placing you both under arrest on suspicion of attempted kidnapping, forgery of federal documents, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Your associates as well," he added, nodding to Pinkerton and the other men, who had begun to look distinctly uncomfortable. "This is outrageous," Blackwell blustered. "I'm the most respected businessman in Copper Creek. You can't—" "I can, and I am," the sheriff cut him off. "Dr. Montgomery, would you be so kind as to fetch those telegrams you mentioned? I believe the circuit judge will find them most interesting when he arrives next week." As the sheriff and his deputies began disarming and restraining the five men, Nate moved to Jenny's side, sheltering her from the rain with his coat. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low and concerned. Jenny nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. The danger wasn't past Walker, and Blackwell still had influence, might still find ways to pursue their vendettas. But for this moment, at least she was safe. "Let's get you inside," Nate urged. "You're soaked through." As they turned toward the house, Sheriff Taylor approached Walker's forged warrant still in his hand. "Miss Caldwell," he said, his weathered face serious beneath his dripping hat, "I don't know what happened in Philadelphia, and frankly, it's not my concern. But these men won't stop coming for you unless we address the root of the problem." "The accusations against my father," Jenny said, understanding his meaning. "Precisely. Dr. Montgomery has contacts in Washington who might help clear your father's name and yours by extension. But to do that, we'll need to know exactly what happened." Jenny glanced at Nate, who nodded encouragingly. The time for secrets was past. "Come inside, Sheriff," she said, making her decision. "It's a long story, and we're all getting wetter by the minute." As they climbed the porch steps, Jenny felt a strange lightness, as if a burden she had carried for so long was finally beginning to lift. The rain continued to fall, washing the earth clean, promising renewal after the storm. Perhaps it could do the same for her. The parlor of Nate's ranch house had transformed into an impromptu war council. Sheriff Taylor stood by the fireplace, thumbing through Walker's forged warrant with a frown creasing his weathered face. Dr. Montgomery sat in one of the armchairs, spectacles perched on his nose as he studied a collection of telegrams spread across his lap. Nate paced near the window, his limp more pronounced with fatigue, while Jenny remained at the piano bench, her fingers resting lightly on the keys, though she drew no sound from them. "The forgery is expert work," the sheriff remarked, holding the document to the light. "If I didn't know Judge Webster had passed, I might have accepted it as genuine." "Walker was always meticulous," Jenny said softly. "It's what made him such an effective businessman and such a dangerous enemy." "What I don't understand," Montgomery interjected, "is why go to such lengths if he's been embezzling from the Caldwell estate? Why not simply disappear with the money? Why pursue you across the country?" Jenny's hands pressed into the piano keys, producing a discordant chord that seemed to hang in the air. "Because I'm the only one who could expose him. My father kept detailed records of all his business dealings. Before I fled Philadelphia, I hid those records where Walker couldn't find them. If I ever returned and claimed my inheritance, those records would reveal everything he's stolen. And the accusations of treason, how do they fit into this?" Sheriff Taylor asked. Jenny drew a deep breath, feeling the weight of years of secrecy. The time had come to share the full truth. not just with Nate, but with these men who had put themselves at risk to help her. My father was a Union officer, as you know, but his role was more complex than most realized. He served not just as a field commander, but as an intelligence officer. She rose from the piano bench, moving to the window where rain still streamed down the glass, reflecting the lamplight in rivulets of gold. During the war, he maintained correspondences with Southern contacts, former classmates from West Point, family connections, business associates. To the outside world, these communications appeared suspicious, potentially treasonous. In reality, they were sanctioned at the highest levels of the Union Army. A double agent, Dr. Montgomery said, with dawning comprehension. Ginny nodded. My father was pretending to share low-level information with his Southern contacts to gain their trust while actually collecting critical intelligence that helped win several key battles. But after the war, such operations became politically inconvenient, Nate added, speaking for the first time since they'd gathered. Men who had done necessary but morally ambiguous work for the Union were disavowed, sometimes persecuted. Exactly, Ginny confirmed. When my father tried to defend himself against post-war accusations, he found that the very operation that had been his patriotic duty was now denied by those who had authorized it. The men who could have vouched for him had either died in battle or moved on to other positions, unwilling to taint themselves by association. And you were implicated how? The sheriff asked, his expression thoughtful. I helped him with his correspondence, Ginny admitted. I was his confidant, his support. After he died, some of his former accusers turned their attention to me. They claimed I had been an active participant in treasonous activities, that I had used my position as a music teacher to pass messages to Southern sympathizers still living in Philadelphia. Walker was chief among these accusers, I presume, Dr. Montgomery said. Yes. He had been my father's business partner during the war, managing their shared interests while my father served. After the armistice, when my father was first accused, Walker publicly distanced himself, portraying himself as an unwitting dupe who had been deceived by a traitor. Ginny's voice hardened. It was a performance worthy of the finest theater in Philadelphia. And all to cover his theft, Nate concluded, moving to stand beside her at the window. I believe so, yes. With my father disgraced and dead, Walker became the executor of his estate. As long as I remained in Philadelphia under the cloud of suspicion, he could control everything. But if I fled, he'd lose that control, Sheriff Taylor finished. And if you ever cleared your name and returned, he'd face not just financial ruin, but criminal charges. Hence the pursuit, Dr. Montgomery added, and the alliance with Blackwell, who has his own reasons for wanting to control Lone Pine. A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by the persistent drum of rain on the roof and the occasional crackle from the fireplace. The full scope of the conspiracy against Ginny, spanning years and thousands of miles, was almost overwhelming in its complexity and malice. What I don't understand, Nate said finally, is Blackwell's comment about Sophia. What connection could she possibly have to all this? Ginny had been pondering the same question since that moment in the church. Sophia knew James's melody. She played it as if she'd heard it many times. Sophia's father was a musician, Dr. Montgomery offered. Samuel Martin. He played fiddle at dances before the war, enlisted with a Virginia regiment, and never came home. A Confederate soldier, Ginny murmured, and his daughter now lives here in Nevada. With her aunt, yes. Sarah Turner took her in after Ellen Sophia's mother died in that house fire last winter. The doctor removed his spectacles, polishing them absently on his handkerchief. Ellen was, well, she wasn't well liked in town. There were rumors. What kind of rumors? Nate pressed. Dr. Montgomery looked uncomfortable. That she had Southern sympathies. That she corresponded with Confederate agents during the war. Nothing was ever proven, of course. Clara gave Ellen piano lessons, Nate said slowly, as if recalling something long forgotten. They became friends. Ellen visited the ranch occasionally, bringing Sophia with her. Could Sophia have heard James play his composition during those visits? Ginny asked. Perhaps. Nate's expression remained troubled. But that doesn't explain Blackwell's insinuation that Sophia has some connection to your situation. Before anyone could respond, a sharp knock at the door startled them all. Sheriff Taylor's hand moved instinctively to his pistol, while Nate stepped protectively in front of Ginny. Who could that be in this weather? Dr. Montgomery wondered. Nate approached the door cautiously. "Who's there?" "Margaret Winters," came the muffled reply. "And I'm not alone." Nate opened the door to reveal the elderly hotel proprietor, soaked to the skin despite her oilskin cape. Beside her stood Sarah Turner, equally drenched with Sophia clutched tightly to her side. The child's face was pale with fear, her eyes wide in the lamplight. "Mrs. Winters," Nate exclaimed quickly, ushering them inside. "Mrs. Turner, what in God's name are you doing out in this storm?" "Fleeing for our lives, or near enough," Margaret replied grimly, removing her dripping cape. "Blackwell's men came to Sarah's house demanding to see Sophia. When she refused, they threatened to burn the place down around them." "My God." Dr. Montgomery rose from his chair. "Are you hurt?" "Just frightened." Sarah answered, her arms still protectively around Sophia. "Mrs. Winters was visiting when they came. She helped us slip out the byway while they were breaking down the front door." "I thought you should know," Margaret said to Ginny. "Whatever they want with Sophia, it has something to do with you." Blackwell made that much clear. Ginny knelt before the frightened child, her heart aching at the terror in those solemn eyes. "Sophia, I'm so sorry you've been dragged into this. Do you know why Mr. Blackwell is looking for you?" The girl didn't respond, but her hand moved to the pocket of her dress, withdrawing a small folded paper. She extended it to Ginny with trembling fingers. "What is it, child?" Margaret urged gently. "Show Miss Caldwell." Ginny accepted the paper carefully, unfolding it to reveal a page of sheet music yellowed with age and water-stained at the edges. The title at the top read, "James's Lullaby for Mother," in a child's careful hand. "This is James's composition," she said, looking up at Nate in confusion. "But how?" "There's writing on the back," Sarah Turner said quietly. "Ellen, my sister, she wrote it there." Ginny turned the paper over to find a message written in faded ink for Sophia. "Keep this safe. When the time comes, it will protect you. The melody holds the key." "Mother, I don't understand," Ginny said, looking between the sheet music and Sophia's frightened face. "Neither do I," Sarah admitted. "Ellen gave it to Sophia just before the fire, made her promise to keep it secret. It was the last thing she said to her before." She trailed off, unable to complete the thought. Nate took the sheet music, studying it with growing confusion. "This is definitely James's handwriting, but I don't see how this composition could protect anyone or what key it could possibly hold." "May I?" Dr. Montgomery extended his hand for the paper. After examining it carefully, he shook his head. "It appears to be an ordinary musical composition to my untrained eye." A memory stirred in Ginny's mind. Her father bent over his desk late at night, writing what appeared to be an ordinary letter but was in fact a coded message to his union superiors. "It's a cipher," she said suddenly. "The melody is a cipher key." "A what?" Sheriff Taylor asked. "A method for encoding secret messages." Ginny turned to Sarah. "Did your sister have any connection to the war effort? Any reason to be sending or receiving encoded messages?" Sarah hesitated, glancing at Sophia, who watched the adults with wide, frightened eyes. "Ellen, she never spoke of it directly, but after Samuel died at Antietam, she seemed to have a purpose beyond mere survival. She received letters sometimes from back east. She'd read them and burned them immediately." "Dr. Montgomery mentioned rumors about Southern sympathies," Nate said carefully. Sarah's face hardened. "Those were lies. If Ellen had any involvement with the war, it wasn't on the Confederate side. She hated what the conflict had done to our country, to her husband, to her life. Whatever she was doing, it was to end the fighting, not prolong it." "Like my father," Ginny murmured. A suspicion began to form in her mind, a connection too tenuous to voice but too compelling to ignore. "Sophia, do you remember your mother ever mentioning a Colonel Caldwell?" The child's eyes widened, and to everyone's astonishment, she nodded. "She spoke of my father," Ginny pressed gently. Sophia looked to her aunt as if seeking permission. Sarah nodded encouragingly. "It's all right, child. You can tell them." The girl took a deep breath, and for the first time since Ginny had met her, she spoke. Her voice was small and rusty from disuse, but clear enough. "Mama said he was a hero, that he saved people no one else could see needed saving." A collective gasp went around the room at hearing Sophia's voice after so many months of silence. Sarah's eyes filled with tears while Margaret pressed a hand to her heart. "Did she say anything else about him?" Ginny asked, struggling to keep her own voice steady. Sophia nodded again. She said when the bad men came looking for his secrets, I should find his daughter, that she would understand the music. The pieces began to fall into place in Jenny's mind. Your mother was one of my father's contacts, not a Confederate sympathizer, but part of his intelligence network. And James's melody is somehow connected to this network. Nate added, his expression troubled. But how James was just a boy not involved in any espionage. Dr. Montgomery cleared his throat. If I may, children are often used as unwitting couriers in intelligence operations. Their innocence makes them above suspicion. Are you suggesting Clara and James were involved in espionage? Nate demanded, anger flashing in his eyes. Not knowingly, perhaps, the doctor hastened to add, but the composition James's melody might have been used as a cipher key without anyone realizing its significance. Jenny studied the sheet music again, this time with new understanding. The melody isn't just a lullaby. It's a key to decoding messages. Messages that could exonerate my father and incriminate Walker. Which explains why Blackwell and Walker are so desperate to find it, Sheriff Taylor concluded. If what you're saying is true, this piece of paper could destroy everything they've built. But how would Blackwell know about it? Margaret wondered. Ellen's been dead for months. Because I played the melody during today's lesson, Ginny realized with horror. Blackwell heard it, recognized it somehow, and connected it to Sophia. We need to decode whatever message this key protects, Dr. Montgomery said. But where is the encoded message itself? Sophia tugged at her aunt's sleeve, then reached into her other pocket and withdrew a second folded paper. This one a letter, the handwriting neat and precise. Mama said to keep them separate, she explained softly, so the bad men couldn't use them together. Ginny accepted the letter with trembling hands. It appeared to be an ordinary piece of correspondence discussing weather and local events in Philadelphia. But to her trained eye, certain phrases stood out as awkward or unnecessary, the hallmarks of an embedded code. This is it, she breathed. With James's melody as the key, we can decode this letter. It must contain evidence that will clear my father's name. And implicate Walker in his crimes, Nate added grimly. A sudden crash of thunder shook the house, making them all jump. The storm outside had intensified, mirroring the tension within the room. First things first, Sheriff Taylor said firmly. We need to get these ladies settled somewhere safe. Blackwell's men will be searching for them, and this ranch is the first place they'll look. The old mining cabin in the eastern hills, Nate suggested. It's remote, defensible, and few people know of its existence. I'll take them, Dr. Montgomery offered. My buggy is better suited to the rough terrain than the sheriff's wagon. I'm coming with you, Ginny said immediately. If Blackwell's men find us, Sophia will need me to understand the cipher. Nate shook his head. It's too dangerous. You'd be better off. I'm tired of hiding, Nate. Ginny interrupted, a steely resolve in her voice that brooked no argument. This is my fight, has been since Philadelphia. I won't cower while others risk themselves on my behalf. Their eyes met across the room, a silent battle of wills. Finally, Nate nodded, accepting her decision, if not agreeing with it. Then I'm coming too, he said firmly. Thomas and Frederick can hold the ranch. Sheriff, you should stay in town. Your sudden absence would raise suspicions. Agreed, Sheriff Taylor replied. I'll keep an eye on our prisoners and see what else I can learn about Blackwell's plans. We'll need to move quickly, Margaret advised, ever practical, despite her advanced years. The storm will cover our departure, but it also makes travel more difficult. As the others prepared to leave, gathering supplies and donning rain gear, Ginny found herself alone with Sophia for a brief moment. The child looked up at her with those solemn eyes now brightened with something like hope. Mama said you'd help me, she said softly. That you'd understand because your papa and my mama were friends. Ginny knelt to the child's level, taking her small hands in her own. I will help you, Sophia, I promise. And when this is over, perhaps you can tell me about your mother. I think she must have been very brave. Sophia nodded, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. She played piano too. Not as pretty as you, but she said music was how brave people talked when words were too dangerous. The simple statement, delivered in the child's rusty voice, struck Ginny to the core. Music as a language of courage, it echoed what Clara had told Nate, that music was her conversation with God. Perhaps they had all been speaking the same language all along, with Whoosh realizing they shared a common tongue. Within the hour, they were ready to depart. Dr. Montgomery's buggy waited outside a canvas cover hastily erected to provide some protection from the relentless rain. Sarah and Sophia were already settled inside, wrapped in blankets against the chill. "I still think you should stay here," Nate said to Ginny as they stood on the porch, the rain pounding the roof above them. "I know," she replied simply, "but I can't." He studied her face in the lantern light, seeing perhaps for the first time not just the woman he had rescued from the auction block, but the daughter of a spy, a woman with steel in her spine and courage in her heart. "Your father would be proud," he said finally. "So would Clara," Ginny countered softly, "and James." Something shifted in Nate's expression at the mention of his son, not the usual pain, but a quiet acknowledgement of a truth he had perhaps been avoiding. "We should go," Margaret called from the buggy, "while the night still gives us cover." With a final glance at the ranch house that had become her sanctuary, Ginny stepped out into the rain, Nate close behind her. The storm enveloped them immediately, and water streaming down their faces and soaking through their clothes despite their protective gear. They had just reached the buggy when Thomas appeared from the direction of the barn, rifle in hand. "Riders coming," he shouted over the storm. "From the south road." "Blackwell's men," Nate growled. "They must have followed Mrs. Turner's trail from town." "Can we outrun them?" Dr. Montgomery asked, already helping Margaret into the buggy. "Not with the roads in this condition," Nate replied grimly. "We'll have to split up, create confusion." "I'll take Mrs. Turner and Sophia in the buggy," the doctor decided quickly. "Head east toward the mining cabin as planned. Mrs. Winters and I will go with Nate on horseback," Ginny added. "Head north, then circle back to the cabin once we've drawn them off." "Too dangerous for Mrs. Winters," Nate objected. "She should go with the doctor." "Nonsense," Margaret interrupted. "I may be old, but I can still ride. And they'll be expecting the girl to be with Ginny. We need to separate them to ensure Sophia's safety." There was no time to argue further. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, barely audible over the storm, but distinct enough to raise alarm. "Go," Nate ordered Dr. Montgomery. "Stay off the main trails. We'll meet at the cabin by dawn if we can." As the buggy pulled away, disappearing quickly into the rain and darkness, Nate led Ginny and Margaret to the barn, where Thomas had 3 horses saddled and waiting. "Frederick's watching the south approach," Thomas reported. 5 riders, maybe 6, armed." "Hold the ranch," Nate instructed him. "Don't engage unless they force it. Our goal is to lead them away, not start a firefight." Thomas nodded, his weathered face grim in the lantern light. "Godspeed, boss." Moments later, they were mounted and moving out the back way, a narrow trail that led through a stand of pines before opening onto the northern pasture. The rain lashed at them mercilessly, driven by a wind that seemed determined to push them back toward the danger they were fleeing. Ginny rode close behind Nate with Margaret between them, the older woman sitting her mount with surprising skill despite her years. The darkness was nearly absolute, broken only by occasional flashes of lightning that illuminated the landscape in stark white light before plunging it back into blackness. They had just cleared the tree line when shouts erupted behind them, followed by the crack of a rifle shot. Their departure had been spotted. "Ride," Nate called over his shoulder. "Don't stop, don't look back." They pushed their horses harder, galloping across the open pasture toward the dark line of trees that marked the northern boundary of Lone Pine. The rain-soaked ground was treacherous, forcing them to trust their mounts to find solid footing in the near-total darkness. A flash of lightning revealed riders emerging from the trees behind them, gaining ground quickly. Another shot rang out, this one closer, the bullet whining past Ginny's ear with terrifying proximity. "They're catching up," Margaret called, her voice barely audible over the storm and the pounding of hooves. Nate veered suddenly to the left, leading them toward a shallow ravine that cut across the eastern edge of the pasture. "The creek will cover our tracks," he shouted. "Follow me." They plunged down the slippery bank into the swollen creek, the cold water reaching the horses' bellies. For a heart-stopping moment, Ginny feared they would be swept away by the current, but the animals found their footing, struggling forward through the rushing water. Behind them, their pursuers had reached the ravine's edge. More shots rang out, spurring them to greater speed, despite the danger of the terrain. "There," Nate pointed ahead to where the creek bent sharply around a rocky outcropping. "We'll leave the water there, split up." As they reached the bend, Nate guided his horse up the far bank, then turned to help Margaret. "You two head northeast through the old logging trail. I'll continue north, draw them off." "No," Ginny objected. "We stay together." "There's no time to argue," Nate insisted. "I know these lands better than anyone. I can lose them in the hills and circle back. He's right, child, Margaret added. Together we're an easy target. Separated, we have a chance. Before Ginny could protest further, the sound of splashing behind them announced their pursuers had entered the creek. Nate made the decision for them, slapping Margaret's horse on the rump to send it up the bank, then wheeling his own mount to face the oncoming riders. Go, he ordered Ginny. I'll find you at the cabin. Nate. Go, Ginny. Trust me. With one last agonized look at his face illuminated briefly by lightning, Ginny turned her horse and followed Margaret up the bank and into the forest beyond. Behind her, she heard Nate's voice raised in challenge, followed by more gunshots and the confused shouts of their pursuers. She and Margaret rode hard through the forest, the older woman setting a pace that belied her years. The logging trail was barely visible, a slightly less dense patch of darkness through the trees, but their horses seemed to sense the path beneath the carpet of sodden pine needles. The sounds of pursuit gradually faded, either because they had successfully escaped or because the storm had swallowed the noise. Either way, Ginny felt no relief. Nate was back there alone, facing men who would kill him without hesitation to get to her. He'll be all right, Margaret called as if reading her thoughts. Nathaniel Harrison didn't survive Antietam and 3 years of grief to die in a rainstorm at the hands of Judd Blackwell's thugs. Ginny wanted desperately to believe her, but fear gnawed at her heart. She had already lost so much: her father, her home, her reputation. The thought of losing Nate as well was unbearable, especially now when so much remained unsaid between them. They rode for what seemed like hours, the rain gradually lessening to a steady drizzle. The eastern sky had begun to lighten almost imperceptibly when Margaret finally called a halt. The horses need rest, she said, dismounting stiffly. And so do we. There's a hunter's shelter nearby where we can catch our breath. The shelter proved to be little more than a lean-to of logs and branches, but it provided some protection from the rain. They tied the horses in the meager cover of a large pine, then huddled together beneath the crude roof. How much farther to the mining cabin? Ginny asked, her voice hoarse from cold and exhaustion. Another hour's ride, perhaps less, Margaret replied, rubbing her hands together for warmth. We should reach it by full dawn if the weather holds. And if Nate doesn't find us there, the older woman's face softened with compassion. Then we'll wait until he does. He's not a man who breaks his promises, Ginny. They fell silent, each lost in her own thoughts, as the forest around them gradually emerged from darkness into the gray half-light of early morning. The rain had stopped completely, though water still dripped from every branch and leaf. He cares for you, you know, Margaret said suddenly, more than he's allowed himself to care for anyone since Claire and James died. Ginny looked away, unable to meet the older woman's knowing gaze. He feels responsible for me. It's not the same thing. Isn't it? Margaret's voice held a gentle challenge. Responsibility born of a promise may be how it began, but that's not what I see when he looks at you now. What do you see? Ginny couldn't help asking. Hope, Margaret smiled slightly, something I wasn't sure Nathaniel Harrison would ever find again. Before Ginny could respond, a twig snapped nearby, startling them both into alertness. Margaret reached for the small pistol Nate had given her before they left the ranch, while Ginny pressed herself against the rough logs of the shelter, straining to hear through the morning stillness. Another snap closer this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching through the wet undergrowth. Ginny held her breath, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain it would give away their position. A figure emerged from the trees, tall and familiar, despite the mud caking his clothes and the exhaustion evident in every line of his body. Nate! Ginny cried, rushing forward without thought. He caught her in his arms, holding her tightly for a moment before setting her gently back. You're safe, he breathed, relief evident in his voice. Thank God. We thought you'd been captured, or worse, Margaret said, lowering her pistol. What happened? Led them on a merry chase through the north pasture, Nate replied grimly. Lost 2 of them when their horses stumbled in a gully. The others gave up when the storm worsened. He looked around, taking in their makeshift shelter. We should move. They'll be searching again now that daylight's coming. They retrieved the horses and set off again, Nate leading the way along the game trails, too narrow and winding for anyone not intimately familiar with the land to follow. The forest gave way to rockier terrain as they climbed into the foothills, the path sometimes disappearing entirely, forcing them to pick their way carefully across stone outcroppings, slick with moisture. The sun had fully risen, though hidden behind a blanket of clouds, when they crested a ridge and saw the mining cabin below them. It was a simple structure of logs and stone built against the side of the hill for protection from the harsh Nevada winters. Smoke rose from its chimney, a welcome sign that Dr. Montgomery had arrived safely with Sarah and Sophia. As they approached, the cabin door opened and the doctor emerged, rifle in hand. Upon recognizing them, he lowered the weapon, relief evident on his face. "Thank heavens," he called. "We were beginning to fear the worst." "Are Sarah and Sophia all right?" Ginny asked as they dismounted. "Shaken but unharmed," Dr. Montgomery assured her. "The child's been asking for you, oh. She seems to think you hold the key to understanding her mother's message." Inside the cabin, Sarah Turner sat at a rough wooden table, Sophia beside her. Both looked up as Ginny entered, the girl's face lighting with something like hope. "You came," Sophia said, her voice still soft but stronger than before. "Mama said you would." "I promised I would help you," Ginny replied, kneeling beside her, "and I keep my promises." "Just like Papa," the child said with surprising certainty. "Mama always said Colonel Caldwell kept his promises even when it was hard." Ginny felt a lump form in her throat at this unexpected connection to her father. "Your mother knew him well, then?" Sophia nodded solemnly. "She said he was the bravest man she ever knew, except for my papa." "Ellen never spoke of this to me," Sarah said, confusion evident in her voice. "I had no idea she was involved with whatever this is." "She was protecting you," Nate suggested, joining them at the table. "The less you knew, the safer you were." "Just as my father protected me," Ginny added softly, "or tried to." She turned her attention to the two papers they had brought from the ranch, James's musical composition and the encoded letter. Spreading them side by side on the table, she studied them intently, trying to discern the pattern that would unlock their secrets. "The melody is the key," she murmured, recalling Sophia's words. "But how does it work?" De Montgomery peered over her shoulder. "I've seen cipher systems that use musical notation before. Each note corresponds to a letter or number. But this melody has only a few distinct notes," Ginny objected. "Not enough for a full alphabet." "Perhaps it's not the notes themselves, but their pattern," Margaret suggested. "The rises and falls, the rhythm." Nate had been silent, staring at his son's composition with an unreadable expression. Now he spoke, his voice low with realization. "It's not just a melody," he said. "Look at the structure. These repeated phrases, the way the notes are grouped. James wasn't just writing music. He was creating a pattern." Ginny studied the composition again, this time seeing beyond the notes to the underlying mathematical structure. "You're right. These groupings, they could represent letter positions. The first note in each measure indicating the word in the sentence, the second note indicating the letter within that word." With trembling fingers, she began to apply this theory to the letter, counting words and letters according to the pattern in James's composition. Slowly, a new message emerged, written in the invisible spaces between the ordinary correspondence. "Walker embezzled union funds through false supply contracts," she read aloud, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Evidence in Caldwell estate records hidden in music room panel behind portrait. Confirmation from General Meade forthcoming. Caldwell operations sanctioned highest levels. Walker knew all, betrayed confidence for profit. Martin witnessed to confession." A stunned silence fell over the cabin as the implications of the message sank in. It was everything Ginny had hoped for, evidence not only of Walker's crimes but of her father's innocence. "Martin," Sarah whispered. "That would be Samuel, Sophia's father." "A witness to Walker's confession," Dr. Montgomery added, "which explains why Walker was so eager to discredit the Martins as well as the Caldwells, and why Ellen kept this secret all these years," Nate concluded. "She was waiting for the right moment, for when it would be safe to reveal the truth." Ginny turned to Sophia, who had been watching the decoding process with intense concentration. "Your mother was very brave, Sophia. She protected this truth even when it would have been easier to let it die." The child nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "She said sometimes being brave means being quiet until the right time to speak." "Like you," Ginny said gently. "You were quiet until it was time to speak." Sophia offered a tremulous smile, the first true smile Ginny had seen from her. "Mama would be happy I talked to you. She said you'd understand about the music." A commotion outside interrupted the moment, the sound of approaching horses moving quickly toward the cabin. Dr. Montgomery rushed to the window, rifle at the ready. "Riders," he reported grimly. "At least 4 of them." Blackwell's men, Margaret asked, fear evident in her voice despite her usual composure. No, the doctor replied, relief washing over his features. It's Sheriff Taylor, and he's not alone. There are two men with him I don't recognize, and he paused, squinting through the dirty glass. I believe that's Judge Bailey from the federal court in Carson City. Nate joined him at the window, his expression changing from wariness to cautious hope. It is Bailey. And those men with him, they're wearing federal marshal's badges. Real ones, not like Pinkerton's forgery. How did they find us? Sarah wondered. Thomas, Nate realized. He must have sent word to town when we fled the ranch. The cabin door opened to admit Sheriff Taylor, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. Behind him came two stern-faced men in the distinctive long coats of federal marshals, followed by an elderly gentleman whose bearing spoke of authority and position. Judge Bailey, Dr. Montgomery greeted him with surprise. This is unexpected. Dr. Montgomery, the judge acknowledged with a nod. I was in Carson City when Sheriff Taylor's urgent message arrived. The accusations were serious enough to warrant my immediate attention. His gaze fell on Ginny, recognition flickering in his eyes. Miss Caldwell, I presume daughter of Colonel William Caldwell. Ginny straightened, facing him directly. I am your honor. I've heard a great deal about you in the past 24 hours, the judge said, his tone carefully neutral. Some of it quite alarming. Sheriff Taylor claims you have evidence regarding serious allegations of embezzlement and fraud against one Elijah Walker of Philadelphia. I do, your honor. Ginny indicated the decoded message on the table. This letter, when deciphered using this musical composition as a key, reveals Walker's crimes and confirms that my father's wartime activities were sanctioned at the highest levels of the Union Army. Judge Bailey examined the documents, his expression gradually shifting from skepticism to interest. This is extraordinary. If authentic, it would constitute powerful evidence indeed. There's more, Sheriff Taylor added. While you were examining those papers, Judge, my deputies discovered something interesting at Walker's rooms at the Silver Crown. A coded ledger detailing funds transferred from the Caldwell estate to accounts in Walker's name, amounts totaling over $50,000. And that's not all, one of the marshals interjected. We received a wire from Philadelphia this morning. General Meade has come forward confirming that Colonel Caldwell was operating under direct orders throughout the war. He's provided documentation to the War Department clearing the colonel's name posthumously. Ginny felt her knees weaken, and she gripped the edge of the table for support. After so long, so many months of fear and flight of shame and secrecy, her father's name would be cleared. The truth would finally be known. Well, Miss Caldwell, Judge Bailey said, his voice gentler now, it appears a great injustice was done to your father and by extension to you. On behalf of the federal judiciary, I offer my sincere apologies. What about Walker and Blackwell? Nate asked, moving to stand supportively beside Ginny. Mr. Walker has been remanded to federal custody, the second marshal answered. He'll be returned to Philadelphia to face charges of embezzlement, fraud, and obstruction of justice. And Blackwell, Dr. Montgomery pressed. Sheriff Taylor's expression hardened. Judd Blackwell was found dead in his cell this morning. Hanged himself with his own belt. Seems he preferred that to facing the music for his crimes. A heavy silence fell over the cabin as they absorbed this news. No one mourned Blackwell, but his sudden end brought a somber note to what should have been a moment of triumph. What happens now? Ginny asked, finally voicing the question that hung unspoken in the air. Now, Miss Caldwell, Judge Bailey replied, you are free to reclaim your life and your inheritance. The Caldwell estate will be restored to your control with all funds embezzled by Walker to be recovered if possible. And the accusations of treason, formally withdrawn, the judge assured her. Your father's record has been amended to reflect his true service to the Union. His honor is restored, as is yours. Tears welled in Ginny's eyes, tears she had held back for so long. Not tears of grief or fear, but of relief of a burden finally lifted after being carried for what felt like a lifetime. Nate's hand found hers warm and steady, his fingers intertwining with hers in a silent gesture of support. When she looked up at him, she saw in his gray eyes not just the reflection of her own relief, but something deeper, something that had been growing between them despite all obstacles. You could return to Philadelphia, he said softly, his voice for her alone. Reclaim your place in society, your teaching career, and all that was taken from you. The question beneath his words was clear, though he didn't voice it directly. Would she leave Nevada? Leave Lone Pine? Leave him? Ginny thought of Philadelphia with its grand concert halls and cultured society, its familiar streets, and the home where she had grown up. It called to her with the siren song of the familiar, the comfortable, the known. But then she looked around the rough cabin at Margaret's knowing smile at Dr. Montgomery's kind eyes at Sarah and Sophia, holding hands across the table at Sheriff Taylor, and the judge discussing legal matters by the door. And finally at Nate, this man who had purchased her freedom at an auction block, who had offered her safety when she most needed it, who had fought for her truth when he could have simply walked away. In that moment, Ginny knew where her future lay. Philadelphia was my past, she said loud enough for all to hear. Nevada is my future. And in Nate's answering smile, she saw that future unfold before her. Not perfect, not without challenges, but rich with possibility and alive with promise. The melody of freedom, so long silenced, had finally found its voice. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn day, the church in Copper Creek was filled to capacity. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting rainbow patterns across the wooden floor from the new stained glass that had been installed, a gift from Virginia Caldwell Harrison to commemorate her wedding day. At the piano, Sophia Martin played a simple prelude, her small fingers moving confidently across the keys. She no longer needed sheet music for this particular piece. James's lullaby had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. She had found her voice both literally and musically in the months since the truth had been revealed. In the front pew, Sarah Turner watched her niece with pride seated beside Margaret Winters, whose latest project was organizing a proper music school for the children of Copper Creek. Dr. Montgomery sat nearby, engaged in quiet conversation with Judge Bailey, who had traveled from Carson City for the occasion. At the back of the church, Nathaniel Harrison waited, uncharacteristically nervous in his best suit, his gray eyes fixed on the doors through which his bride would soon enter. The past 6 months had transformed him, softening the hard edges of grief while preserving the strength that had carried him through his darkest days. Lone Pine Ranch had transformed as well. The house had been expanded, the garden enlarged, the barn rebuilt and improved. James's room, once preserved like a shrine, had been respectfully reorganized into a music room where Ginny taught piano to children from town, including Sophia, who showed remarkable talent. But the greatest transformation had been in Nate himself. Elected mayor of Copper Creek in a near-unanimous vote after Blackwell's death, he had thrown himself into improving the town with the same dedication he had once reserved solely for his ranch. The water rights that had been such a point of contention were now fairly distributed, ensuring prosperity for all rather than wealth for a few. And through it all, Virginia Caldwell had been by his side, her quiet strength and unwavering courage, a perfect complement to his determined leadership. Their courtship had progressed slowly, respectful of the ghosts that still occasionally walked the halls of Lone Pine, but with a certainty that grew stronger with each passing day. When Nate had finally proposed on a summer evening beneath the stars, Ginny's acceptance had been immediate and wholehearted. Clara and James would always be part of him, just as Colonel Caldwell would always be part of her. But they had found room in their hearts for new love, new beginnings, new hope. The church doors opened, and Ginny appeared radiant in a gown of ivory silk, a simple bouquet of wildflowers in her hands. As she walked down the aisle toward Nate, Sophia transitioned seamlessly from James's lullaby to the traditional wedding march, the melodies intertwining like the past and future coming together in perfect harmony. When Ginny reached Nate, he took her hands in his eyes never leaving hers as Reverend Parker began the ceremony. The words were traditional, but the meaning behind them was anything but ordinary, a promise between two people who had found each other against all odds, who had fought side by side for truth and justice, who had learned that love could bloom even in the rocky soil of grief and loss. "I do," Ginny said clearly, when the moment came, her voice carrying to every corner of the church. "I do." Nate echoed, his deeper tone resonating with the same certainty. As Reverend Parker pronounced them, husband and wife, Sophia began to play again. Not a traditional recessional, but a new composition she had written herself, inspired by James's lullaby, but distinctly her own. A melody of hope, of renewal, of freedom. Hand in hand, Nathaniel and Virginia Harrison walked back down the aisle, stepping out of the church into the bright Nevada sunlight, and the future that awaited them, a future built on truth, strengthened by adversity, and sustained by the most powerful melody of all, love.